He drove through the dark with a dog that wasn't his, bleeding from a cut on his hand he hadn't noticed until the heater came on and the warmth made it sting. The dog sat in the passenger seat like it had always been there, like it had been waiting for a ride home. Gideon Harte had not planned on stopping. He'd been on his way back from the hardware store in Merrickville. A bag of weather stripping on the back seat. Nothing else on his mind except getting the cold out of the mudroom before the temperature dropped again. It was early March in the Ottawa Valley, and the cold that year had a particular cruelty to it. Not the dramatic cold of January that everyone braced for, but the slow grinding kind, the kind that showed up in your joints at 2 in the morning and reminded you that you weren't 40 anymore. He was 53. He'd done 2 decades in the Canadian Navy, the last 8 of them attached to Joint Task Force 2, and he'd come back from places he didn't name in conversation with a body that still worked and a mind that worked differently than it used to. When his wife Leanne died, pancreatic cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end, he sold the house in Canada and bought a property outside of Lanark that was mostly field and tree line and silence. He'd told himself it was temporary. That had been 3 years ago. He wasn't unhappy, exactly. He'd stopped expecting happiness the way other people seemed to expect it, the way it was advertised on television and implied in conversations at the grocery store. He was functional. He was fine. He had a wood stove and a truck, and a property that needed enough maintenance to keep him busy, and a neighbor named Archie Fleming who brought him frozen venison every December, and didn't ask questions, which Gideon considered one of the finest qualities a person could have. He had not had a dog since Atlas. Atlas had been his working dog, a Belgian Malinois, lean and black-muzzled and so attuned to Gideon that people who saw them together sometimes asked if they were related, which was a joke Gideon had always laughed at and never entirely dismissed. Atlas had died on a Thursday in November, 3 years before Leanne, which meant that Gideon had lost his dog and then his wife inside the same 4 years, and had come out the other side with the distinct sensation of a man who had survived things he wasn't sure he deserved to survive. He had not planned on another dog. He'd been clear about that with himself. And then he saw the crate. It was off the side of County Road 29, half hidden in the ditch, the kind of wire crate people used for transport. And it took him a full second after he passed it to register what he'd seen. A shape moving inside, something pale and small pressed up against the wire. He drove another 100 meters on instinct and then stopped. Sat there with the engine running, told himself he'd imagined it, or that it was someone's dropped equipment, or that it wasn't his problem. He turned around. The crate had a luggage lock on the latch, the cheap kind, already rusted. He broke it with the flat of his hand against a rock from the ditch, and the cut came from the edge of the wire when the door swung open. He didn't notice. What he noticed was the dog. A Labrador mix, he thought, young, maybe 8 months, white with a large patch of brown over one eye, pressed so far back in the crate that she'd made herself almost flat against the wire, shaking. Looking at him with eyes that had already decided this wasn't going to get better. He knew that look. He'd seen it on people. "All right," he said. "It's all right." She didn't believe him. But when he crouched and held out the back of his hand and waited, 3 minutes, maybe 4, long enough for 2 cars to pass and not stop. She eventually crawled forward and pressed her cold nose against his knuckles. And that was that. He named her Pepper on the drive home because of the way she sneezed 3 times in a row when he turned the heat up, and it was the first name that came to him, and he had always gone with first instincts. The vet in Perth the next morning was a woman named Dr. Alcott, who had a gray braid over one shoulder, and the particular manner of someone who had seen most things and been surprised by very little. She went over Pepper methodically and announced that she was approximately 9 months old. Underweight but not dangerously so, with no microchip and no sign of any injury beyond general neglect and a mild case of the kind of anxiety that resolved itself, in Dr. Alcott's experience, with consistent routine and someone who didn't panic. "You don't seem like someone who panics," Dr. Alcott said, looking at Gideon over her glasses. "Retired habit," he said. She looked at his hand, which he'd cleaned and taped that morning. "What did you do?" "Wire cut. Getting her out. You should have that looked at properly." "I will." He didn't, but it healed fine. Pepper spent the first 2 weeks at the house under the kitchen table. She came out for food and to go outside and then went back under. Gideon did not make a project of her. He did not consult YouTube videos about rehabilitating fearful dogs or buy anxiety wraps or attempt to force the issue with enthusiastic energy the way he'd seen people do, with the well-meaning brightness that made frightened animals more frightened. He just moved through the house as he always had, slowly, without urgency, doing the things that needed doing, and let her watch. The wood stove was what did it, in the end. On the third evening, he lit it earlier than usual, because the temperature had dropped hard by 4 in the afternoon, and the mudroom still wasn't sealed right. He sat in the chair beside it with a cup of tea he barely touched and a book he'd read before, and 40 minutes in, he felt a weight settle against his left foot. He looked down. Pepper had come out from the kitchen and was pressed against his ankle, facing the fire, her eyes half closed. He did not make a sound or move his foot. He sat there until his tea was cold and read the same paragraph 4 times and felt something he hadn't expected to feel, which was simply the sense that the room was less empty than it had been before. She started talking about 3 weeks in. That was how he came to think of it, though he acknowledged freely to himself that talking was not precisely the word. What she did was make a specific sound. Not quite a bark, not a whine, something between a grumble and a low note, almost conversational in its cadence, and she did it in situations that were after a while consistent enough to be understood. She made it when his alarm went off and he'd silenced it twice already. She made it when he'd been sitting too long without moving. She made it when someone turned onto the property road, which was her version of an announcement. And she made it, once, at 3 in the morning, standing at the bedroom door, in a tone that woke him fully and immediately, in the way that only certain sounds could. He was out of bed and down the hall before he was entirely conscious. The wood stove. He'd thought he'd banked it properly. He hadn't. He got it sorted in under 2 minutes, stood in the living room afterward in his socks and looked at Pepper, who was sitting in the hallway looking back at him with an expression that managed to be both satisfied and reproachful, and said out loud to the empty house, "Fair enough." He called Archie Fleming the next morning from the driveway, which was where he made phone calls because the reception was better there. "I have a dog," he said. There was a pause. "I thought you weren't getting a dog. That was before the dog." Archie was the kind of man who understood that certain things happened in a way that bypassed decision-making, and so all he said was, "What kind?" And Gideon said, "Lab mix, white, brown patch on her face, 9 months, found her in a crate on 29, and Archie said, "Send me a picture." And when the picture arrived on his end, there was a longer pause, and then, "She looks like she runs the place." "She's working on it," Gideon said. He hadn't been to the Legion in Lanark since the November before, not because of any falling out. The men and women there were good people, most of them, people who didn't need things explained, but because the parking lot was uneven and the walk from his truck to the door was enough time for him to talk himself back into it. He was always going to go next time. Next time had accumulated. He went the Saturday after the wood stove incident, because Pepper would not get into the truck, and so they'd gone for a walk instead, and the walk had gone longer than he intended. And by the time he'd turned around, he was 2 kilometers down the road that ran past the Legion, and he'd thought, well, he tied her to the bike rack out front with a long lead and a bowl of water from his truck. And she watched him go to the door with the expression of a person being left somewhere they'd been before and not necessarily liked. He told her he'd be an hour. She kept looking at him. He was there for 4 hours. He'd forgotten, or not forgotten, but lost access to the memory in the way that things you've stopped doing can stop feeling real. He'd forgotten what it was like to be in a room of people who understood things without being told. He'd forgotten the particular ease of it. He sat with a man named Terence Doyle, who'd done 22 years with the Van Doos, and had a white beard and a laugh that arrived without warning, and they talked about nothing in particular for 2 hours, and Gideon had 2 beers and listened more than he spoke. And when he finally went back outside, Pepper stood up and made the low grumble noise at him, which he was fairly certain meant she'd been right and he already knew it. He started going on Saturdays. Spring came to the valley the way it always did. Reluctantly, in stages with setbacks. The snow pulled back from the fields and the mud came in behind it, and the creek at the south end of the property ran high and cold for 6 weeks. Pepper discovered the creek at the beginning of April and made it her personal project, wading in at varying depths and coming back to Gideon each time as if reporting findings. He'd started leaving the back door unlocked in the morning so she could go out at her own schedule, and he'd started sleeping past 6, which he hadn't done in years. It was Terence who introduced him to the idea of the walk. Not a philosophical walk, a practical one. A group of them, veterans and spouses and a few community members, who did a Saturday morning walk in the spring and fall, 8 kilometers out to the falls on the Clyde River and back. A mental health initiative, Terence said, which Gideon started to respond to with the reflex he always had about that phrase, but Terence talked past it. It's mostly just walking and complaining about the government. You'd fit right in. He brought Pepper. Of course he brought Pepper. There were 11 people the first Saturday, and Pepper walked through the group with the systematic attentiveness of someone doing a head count, nose to hand, nose to knee, pausing longest with a woman named Bev, who was in her 70s and walked with a cane, and had brought her own dog. A senior beagle named Jack, who moved with the deliberate dignity of a creature that had decided falling would be beneath him. Pepper and Jack walked together for most of the morning, Pepper slightly ahead, occasionally checking back, which Terence watched for a minute, and then said to Gideon, "Your dog's shepherding my neighbor's dog." "She does that," Gideon said. He meant it about the dog. He watched Pepper and noticed it was also what he was doing, the old habit of it, moving at the pace of the slowest person, aware of the edges of the group without making it visible. He had not intended to do that. He wasn't sure when it had started again. By the second week, there were 14 people. By the third, 16. Someone had posted about it in the local Facebook group, and then a woman named Sandra, who ran the general store in town, started keeping a water dish by the front step for the dogs, and had started coming herself, which meant her husband, Murray, came. And Murray was retired OPP, and had things to say about everything and said them at length, and Gideon found that he didn't mind. Pepper had opinions about Murray. She liked him, which she expressed through following him at a distance of exactly 2 feet for most of the walk, and putting her head under his hand whenever he stopped talking to breathe. Murray, who had lost his own dog in February, accepted this solemnly and with visible relief. There was one Saturday in May. The third one, when the trilliums were out along the trail, and the light came through the maples at the angle that makes the Ottawa Valley look like somewhere a person would choose to be, when Gideon stopped on the footbridge over the Clyde and looked back at the group strung out along the path behind him, Bev and Jack moving steady and slow, Murray talking with his hands, Terence's laugh arriving suddenly at the back, a kid, 19, maybe, grandson of one of the members, who'd started coming and never given an explanation, walking beside his grandmother with his hands in his pockets. Pepper sat beside Gideon's boot and looked back too. He'd thought, when he'd moved out here, that the solitude was what he needed. He still believed that in a specific and private way, but standing on that bridge, he understood that what he'd been doing for 3 years wasn't solitude so much as removal, the careful subtraction of himself from places where something might be asked of him or offered to him, which were the same motion done from fear. He hadn't been resting. He'd been waiting, in the way of someone who's been hurt enough to believe that waiting is the safest position. He looked at the dog. She looked at him. She made the grumble sound, short and low, which in this context he interpreted correctly as, "Yes, I know. Let's keep walking." He bent down and scratched behind her ears, the spot that made her lean into his hand every time, and she let him, and they stood there for a moment in the May light on the bridge over the Clyde, and then he straightened up and they walked on. He was not the same man who had turned around on County Road 29 in March. He wasn't entirely sure what the difference was yet. He thought it might take a while to name. He thought that was all right. That fall, he helped Terence build a small shelter at the Legion trailhead. A simple thing, a roof and 2 walls, a bench, somewhere to wait out a rain. Murray organized the lumber donation from the co-op. Sandra's husband did the concrete for the posts. Bev brought sandwiches on the second day and sat on the tailgate of Gideon's truck supervising with Jack in her lap and opinions about the roof pitch that turned out to be correct. Pepper spent both days moving between the work site and Bev's tailgate position and back, apparently satisfied that nothing was being done incorrectly, and that the sandwiches were being distributed equitably. When they finished, Terrence screwed a small piece of steel to the inside wall of the shelter. It said, simply, Clyde River Walk, started spring 2026. All welcome. Dogs welcome. Gideon looked at it for a moment. Then he loaded his tools into the truck and Pepper jumped in after him and they drove home through the fall color, the valley orange and gold all the way to the tree line. He thought about Leanne. He thought about Atlas. He thought about the way certain things end and certain things continue, and how sometimes what continues is something you hadn't known was beginning. The mudroom was sealed now. Had been since April. He hadn't done it for any particular reason. He'd just noticed one morning that the cold wasn't getting in anymore, and understood that at some point he must have finished it and moved on.